While I would never want to give away trade secrets, I can tell you that when I meet with a wedding couple, I have a clear homework directive. Make a timeline of your relationship from the beginning until this moment, I tell them, and give no further instructions. Later, we'll talk it through. I want all the color commentary on their first trip together, or when they met each other's friends, or even their first argument. I do want to know all those moments, but what I really want to understand is how they will tell the story. Because every family has an origin story, but really none of us, or rarely do we agree on where it begins. I'll notice that one partner will begin their timeline with the first date, while the other starts with the first swipe. I never remember if it's left or right, which is the good one, so whichever one. One partner actually begins with their friendship with the mutual friend who introduced them. Another starts years back at the very first concert they attended of the band they both loved that eventually brought them together. Same couple, ultimately same story, but different beginnings. Same facts, but different narratives. Now, our tradition knows something about this also. On Passover, our tradition's grand night of storytelling, the rabbis teach that we begin with degradation, mignut, and end l'shevach, and we end with praise. I like it. It's clear, it's linear, it's just the sort of plan a rule follower like me really appreciates. Only the rabbis then immediately ask, well, which degradation? One rabbi answers it beginning with Genesis, beginning with Abraham, and says that our disgrace is that we once were idol worshipers. The other rabbi comes along and starts with Exodus and says, no. Our disgrace was our enslavement. The very same Jewish story, maybe leading to the very same place, with two very different beginnings. Or, more timely, we can take our Torah this week, which finds the Israelites wandering in the desert, hungry and kvetching. This is not a beginning of a story. It is, in the words of Brene Brown, the messy middle. The Israelites have already left Egypt. They've crossed the sea. They've stood at Sinai. The covenant has been given. The Mishkan has been built. They are no longer slaves, but have not yet reached the promised land. They're somewhere in between. And perhaps that's precisely why they start telling stories. Because when we find ourselves in the messy middle, Brown teaches, we often try to make sense of where we are by telling ourselves a story about how we got there. So this week, where do our Israelites begin? Not with the splitting of the sea, not with slavery in Egypt, not with the Ten Commandments, not the golden calf, nor the miraculous fire of God's presence. Our Israelites this week begin with fish. Zacharnu et hadaga asher nochal b'mitzrayim chinam. We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. It always strikes me as a little bit comical, but tonight I want us to listen to the way they share this information. Not we ate fish, not there was fish, Zacharnu. We remember this fish that we ate. We remember is an act of storytelling. The Israelites are constructing for themselves a narrative about who they are and where they've come from. But really, of all the chapters available to them, miracles and wonders and plagues and seas splitting, why start here? Partly, I think, or maybe entirely, because the chapter we choose to start with becomes the lens through which we interpret everything else. So if Egypt begins with fish, then wilderness looks like deprivation. But if Egypt begins with slavery, well, then the wilderness looks like freedom. And nothing has changed except the beginning. Over the last several weeks, I have found myself teaching some of the foundational narratives of modern Jewish life. And I will tell you that even now, putting together a single class on anti-Semitism or Zionism requires asking a surprisingly difficult question. I have to ask, where does that story begin? I should confess here that I outsourced the Zionism lecture to an outside expert, but he began with exactly the same question. He said, where does the story of Zionism begin? Is it with Herzl? Is it with Russian pogroms or the Iraqi Farhud? Is it with centuries and centuries of Jewish longing for Zion? Is it with our multiple expulsions? Is it with the modern emancipation? And I took our students through a riveting hour-and-a-half lecture asking, where does the story of anti-Semitism begin? Does it begin with the destruction of the temple? With the rise of Christianity? With the blood libels? With modern nationalism? Nothing changes except the beginning. This year, Rabbi Yoshi gifted our clergy team with the opportunity to learn from one of my most beloved teachers, Rabbi Dr. Michael Marmer. In his recent book, Living the Letters, he uses the Hebrew alphabet to explore some of the central questions and tensions of our modern Jewish lives. The chapter we studied most recently is called Reshit, beginning, and it takes its name not only from the beginning of Genesis, from Bereshit, but from the praise we will read in just a few moments in our prayer for the state of Israel, which describes the modern state of Israel as Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the beginning flowering of our redemption. And in introducing the chapter to us, he posed that very question, which seems to now be following me. He says, where does that story begin? He sat with us and asked, if you're telling the story, even just of the last 2 years in Israel, where do you start? He said, do you start with October 6th, when all was as before? Do you start with October 7th, with just crisis and utter devastation? Or do you start with October 8th, with pain and anger and even a thirst for revenge? Or, he asked, do you start in 2005 with a disengagement from Gaza, in 1967 when Israel gained control of Gaza? Do you start in 1948? How far back do you go? And when does the story begin? Because as he said also, stories never really begin in just one place. But where you choose to begin determines how you tell the story. And maybe this helps explain why so many of our conversations, particularly about Israel, feel impossible right now. If you follow Jewish press, you may have noticed that within the Reform movement and far beyond it, there are some tough arguments about Zionism and anti-Zionism, about Jewish safety and Palestinian dignity, about history and responsibility and power. Conversations are painful and they're urgent and they matter. But with these past few weeks, I've been wondering if we enter them assuming that we disagree only about the conclusions. Maybe we do. That would kind of be a little neater and easier. But maybe we're also disagreeing about the beginnings. Because again, one person might be beginning with October 7th and another with October 8th. One person is starting with 1967, another with 1948, and another centuries before that. One person might begin with Palestinian displacement and dispossession, and another person beginning with centuries of Jewish exile, and yet another beginning with the dream of return. But perhaps none of this is new and particular to this moment, not in Jewish history, not in our lives. Because long before we were arguing about Israel, the rabbis understood, again, that where we begin a story shapes the very story we tell. Because if Egypt begins with fish, then the wilderness looks like deprivation. And if Egypt begins with slavery, well, then the wilderness looks like freedom. Nothing has changed except the beginning. So perhaps that is worth remembering the next time we find ourselves telling a story about who we are and where we've been, and particularly maybe where we have headed. And perhaps even more, it's worth listening for when someone else's story begins. So where do you start? And why do you start there? Shabbat Shalom.